So I think the participants are here, and welcome everybody. This is a webinar that it's a third installment of this conversation that's led by the International Network to End Violence Against Women and Girls. And it's really a conversation, a South-South conversation. And we thought that with the 30 years conversation of the Beijing platform and the stage, in the global stage we're in, it was really important to have a conversation to reset and really reset our thinking, our analytical approach to this. So welcome on behalf of Inevawg. This meeting will be recorded. It will be available in YouTube in our channel after. And you can use the chat to post questions, but you won't be able to participate as such. But if you can please share your questions or comments, but let's not flood the chat. We highly appreciate it. This meeting will not be fully translated, but we will have a simultaneous interpretation when Ana Marcela speaks. And thank you, everybody. I will now introduce our amazing moderator. Toko Mache is one of the founding members of the Inevawg network. She's also in the steering committee. She has also been a leader all over the African continent and probably one of the best people to lead this conversation. So I'm going to give over to her. Thank you, Toko.
Thank you, Maria. Welcome, everyone, to this webinar. Looking at the time is very tight. So what I will do, I want to use this portion of the time to introduce the four presenters before I go to the first, to the introduction and framing of Inevawg. We have Yokling, who is the executive director of the Third World Network, an international research and advocacy organization with its roots in Malaysia. I'm not going to read the full bio because time is of essence. And then we have Rosanna Issa, who is the executive director of Sisters in Islam, a Malaysian NGO promoting Muslim women's rights within the framework of progressive thought on Islam, human rights principles, constitutional guarantees, and women's lived realities. We also have Anne Marcela Montanaro, who is a lecturer and researcher in the area of philosophy of law, feminism, post-colonial and decolonial studies, human rights. Then we have Leslie Ann Foster, who is the founder and executive director of Masmanyane Women's Rights International, and a founding member and current lead of Inevawg. Those are our four speakers. They will have a very short time to talk to the questions that will be given, but we hope that some of the things will be picked up during the interaction and the questions and the additions from the speakers. So now let's kick in already without wasting time with Leslie Ann giving us a framing of the conversation about South Africa and an example of the immediate impact of US policies and authoritarian decisions in the life of women. And Leslie Ann, we're also asking you to talk about the travel ban by the US and the implications for borders worldwide. So over to you. You are muted.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Sorry for that. Good afternoon or good morning and good evening to Yokling. I'm sure she's way ahead of us. It's good to be here and to have this conversation. I think at the moment when there's been such significant geopolitical shifts in the world that are affecting each one of us in the South, it's a critical conversation that we have now. As we know, there's been this slew of executive orders that has foisted onto the world, particularly on the global South. In South Africa, we've been really, really hard hit because not only has he stopped the funding to South Africa of our HIV, AIDS, and health programs, but he has now put additional executive orders in place that prevents us from getting any kind of support from the US. And this is tragic. The immediate effect has been that thousands of health workers, community workers, have been put off work and have gone back to their homes now without any source of income. So the loss of income for thousands of people, not just from USAID, but from South African NGOs and government institutions, because both were being supported by Trump, has had a massive, massive impact, on the communities which we serve. So South Africa was getting around 337 billion South African rands from them for work in the health sector and education sector. That's been totally now annihilated, which means that we will have the largest antiretroviral program in the world, because we have the largest number of people living with HIV in the world, has been totally decimated. Well, totally decimated is maybe an exaggeration, because 17%, 17% was actually funded by the US, and that's a lot. But that means the health implications, the threat of increases in death is very real for those people. Across the world, the malaria programs have come to a halt. Several other the Ebola programs have come to a halt because all of those were funded, by the US across Africa and other places in the world. So the implication for health is huge. So the health indicators are going to change dramatically because of the withdrawal of that support from the US. It does mean that as countries we have to, and South Africa has been doing this, scrambling to find its own support, which it hadn't done before, because for a long time the US has been providing that support. But it is a life-threatening impact from the US, and that's deeply concerning to us. The other issues are his ongoing attacks. The travel bans are horrendous. Some people, that are in the US have been for a long time, are being expelled from that country. Many of them are having to come back to Africa into very dire situations. Some of them who are students are having the studies, just short-lived. And there's no logic applied in any of the decisions that are made. They're just made, off the seat of his pants. Well, obviously, he's got very good people advising him on this. And I think one of the things that was said, in our own board meeting was that this has been a long, well thought through plan. It isn't Trump just jumping up and thinking about it now. Since his last time as a president of America, he had a gap in between, and then this time he has had they have had, the people back in him have had time to think about this. I think what the biggest concern for all of us is that this is not just the US. It's not, we kid ourselves that it's the US. There's a shift, a significant shift to the right, towards right-wing conservative governments. I've made calls to Holland, to Germany, to Sweden, to Norway, and most of these countries, France, are saying that the shift to the right is what we are, which it's a significant shift. And we're not going to see that writing itself in the next decade, probably. The shift is virtually permanent. That's the first thing. The second thing is it's a shift in our value system. So human rights and equality and all of these principles that we work with, they did from that perspective, from their perspective. Look what Trump has done in terms of gender. He's now labeling women like all of us on this call as gender extremists. And he's calling for only two genders, male and female. I mean, all of this, which is going to filter down to our national levels, our regional and national levels, in some places like in Africa, where there's such hectic conservatism, you're going to see a rise in homophobia and a rise in the killings and the, the oppression of people who don't identify with either of the two genders that Trump has put up there. So there's this fundamental shift in our value system, in human rights as we understand it, is something that we need to be grappling with, and we need to be thinking about it. And we see it now in the travel bans, because that's also just a blatant discrimination against people, without any real basis for what he is doing. I think we've got a real problem across the world, especially in the South, because he's targeting us. South Africa's had the unfortunate eye of Trump on us, and he is gunning us for many reasons, of course. I mean, it's our stance on Gaza and our fight, and our protests against what Israel's doing. So all of those political moves that have taken place are what he has in his line of sight, and he's going after us. I mean, the information on which he's basing the decisions he's making is really, really very thin. So we are struggling on, and we're going to see, a dip in the kind of work that we've done, and we need to strengthen ourselves, strengthen responses and our resolve in calling for equality, in calling for a protection of human rights, in calling for the recognition, as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, for the rights of all people, and also, I mean, part of international law is the sovereignty of countries. South Africa is saying, but leave us alone. We have a sovereign right to do what we want to do. We have a sovereign right to disagree with other states, to disagree with other political processes. And Trump is behaving like one activist has said, like the landlord of the world. It's my way or the highway type of thing. So just as an introduction, and I think coming into that, the International Network of Violence Against Women has its own political agenda. That political agenda, if it's Trump hears about that, he would absolutely trample it. So we have to think about how to maintain our position, maintain our values, and to fight for social justice, for fairness and equality across the board. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie-Ann, for that framing of the conversation we're having. We will move without any delays to part one of this conversation. Part one looks at emerging issues and challenges. I'll start with you, Yokeling. What is the most useful way to frame and understand the ways China is shifting geopolitics, and what is happening and how?
Thank you, Thoko, and thank you very much, Leslie-Ann, for that framing. I think one of the things I just want to stress is that we often hear this framing of China as the new superpower that is going to take over the US economy in a number of years' time. But I think we really need to understand that the real superpower and hegemony continues to be the United States. In terms of just its GDP, in the 2025 numbers, if you look at it, the US GDP is about 30, it's per capita GDP for the US is about 90,000, 90. For China, is about 14, 14 per capita GDP. In absolute terms, the US GDP is 30 trillion. And we're talking about China at 19. So I think that in the first place, we need to be clear about. The other thing is the US dollar. Our debt, our trade are predominantly denominated in the US dollar. And that itself makes it the landlord and the financier of the world. That currency issue holds us in the South very much in a trap. The other issue that we need to think about is the IMF and World Bank. Because of its shareholder base voting, de facto, the United States has a veto power. We are very conscious about the Security Council and the veto power of the 5 nations, but the de facto veto power in the financial world, in the Bretton Woods institutions, is the United States. So the combination of this needs to be at the heart of our understanding. What does it mean in the shift of geopolitics? I think China, for us, especially in this region in Southeast Asia, we have over the years, in terms of trade, moved more and more towards China, more diversified. But ultimately for the world, the biggest consumer of goods is still the United States. And that export-led production system traps the South. So when Trump does what he's doing now, and I would say the Trump administration, because as Leslie Ann says, it's not just him, one guy, it's the team of them, right? So all these tariffs, craziness and chaos is really disruptive and it's showing how vulnerable we are. So China is very vulnerable in that sense. As one of the biggest economies, because of its linked to the consumption patterns and the ability to buy of the United States, tariffs war against China is very disruptive. So China wants to defend itself. All of us are now going to be we've always been about national interest, but who has the power to assert national interest? So for us to understand China, we also need to look at perhaps the history of different relationships. China, Africa, for example, has a very different history. How do we tap into that to basically have more South-South discussion? BRICS, China is the co-founder. But Brazil has been very active. And I think Latin America gives us also a different dynamic, which Anna probably will talk about too. So we have to navigate this geopolitics. Uncertainties, and for many of us in Asia, is not about choosing between the US and China, because we need to protect our own people. In the midst of all this, where does the women's rights issue come up? And I think this is really, if you look at what happened in the SW this year, I was talking very briefly with Maria early on. The declaration is a reiteration and a reaffirmation of things for the last 30 years. I think we're lucky today to even have that reaffirmed. And you look at the United States' position, they're denying the right to development, they're denying gender, they're denying even the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. So we are in that stage where we need to rethink. There are difficulties, but as civil society and women's rights movements, we have a lot of rethinking, and we need to talk to each other, we need to understand, and nothing is going to be clear. And I think that uncertainty requires us to really work much, much more together. And that would, I think, be the way to move forward.
Thank you for that, Yokling. I have a follow-up question. Would you consider China is shifting the conversation and approaches to international cooperation?
I think China is not doing it by themselves, because right now their economy has been, since COVID and past COVID, actually quite depressed, right? Consumption is low. Unemployment among young people graduating from universities is high. So they have to grapple with that. On top of that, all these unilateral trade sanctions and tariffs. So they have to grapple with a lot of domestic challenges. And there are issues around whether they should. I have never believed that we should give a few countries the title of leadership role. in multilateralism. I think we need to move away from that. Many of us are coming from more middle-sized countries, and others, many are from smaller countries. We need to reconfigure that. And how do we then relate to the Chinas and the US and Europe and all that? I think that's the kind of question. We should start with our own clarity, with the work together among the smaller nations and middle-income countries, and then we can have a conversation with China. So I don't see China doing it by themselves. BRICS is now more expanded. I think South Africa is going to chair BRICS this year in a very difficult situation. Next year is going to be the not BRICS, G20, sorry. G20, it's maybe it should be the end of G20, because, what we're going to see happening in this year in South Africa for the G20 is going to be very difficult. Next year is going to be the United States. Why should developing countries be second, third class citizens in the G20 grouping? We as civil society, I think we should really call for our countries who are involved in the G20 to rethink. At the same time, BRICS is expanding. So it's not going to be just about China or India or South Africa or Brazil as a founding members, or Russia. It's going to be a broader coalition of countries. So I think that conversation for us as civil society is, how do we better understand and engage with our governments who are in all these different so-called configurations of countries.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Please hold your questions, write them down, and at the end, when we have come to the end of the different sections, you will have time to do the questions. Now we move on to Rosanna. The first question I have, Rosanna, is, there are a lot of assumptions and contradictions in the news about violence against women and girls in these Islamic countries. What is the best way for women's rights activists in the global South to show solidarity and be allies for the change organization like yours?
Thank you very much, Thoko. So we saw how violence against women escalated during COVID-19. And even after, there doesn't seem to be any indication of the numbers going down in the following years. And we're aware that all these numbers are significantly underreported anyway. We know that some Muslim majority countries have been very successful in establishing protection for women through legal frameworks. And women in these countries have become more aware of their rights and the existence of such laws to protect them. But to what extent are they successful in getting justice, protection, and remedies that are accorded in the law? And we're also seeing, more women getting harmed and killed. And not only are the survivors are younger, but so too are the perpetrators. So while the legal framework exists in some of these countries, society's views about how women should be treated face an uphill battle. What more with influences that rally the call for normalization of misogyny, violence, and discrimination online and physically. So for most Muslim communities, the religious texts, the religious figures, the religious authorities still hold sway in the justifications for the way we think, act, and behave around women. The way I see it, Indonesia is the best example of how women ulama, comprising both women and men, play a role in the progressive interpretation of religious texts and issuing religious decrees on the elimination of violence and ending of harmful practices. But this, of course, still has to be supported by state actors, lawmakers, enforcement agencies to ensure that women and girls' rights are upheld and action is taken accordingly. For women activists in the South, we really need to push for our voices to be raised and more content to be shared, especially on social media. And, more opinion pieces coming out to shape the thought of the public in regards to violence against women. Even the exchange that we are doing now is already valuable in terms of supporting women in Muslim majority countries to know what kind of rights, legislations, and legal frameworks exist in other countries for them to know that they can advocate for the same or even better. Now, the human rights framework, has taken, a big beating, but it's still important and it's still critical for us to defend and uphold, especially in light of right-wing groups already co-opting the language and the spaces. And we see the importance of the human rights framework and international human rights law when it came to the war in Gaza and against the Palestinians. So we are all struggling with this. And in a way, we really need to figure out how to push through, especially in relation to language and narratives that resonate with the public. We've got to figure out ways that are more creative. And I think the way we um, figure out, the inclusivity of our movements is going to be key in terms of the way we are able to push through the different and diverse communities that are there in reality.
Thank you, Rosanna. Next question I have is it timely to consider the influence countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey are having through Islam as an example of new form of geopolitical influence? And how does this influence Islamic nations in other continents?
This is a very interesting question. The thing is, Saudi Arabia, in terms of geopolitics, has always been influential through its petrodollars pouring into various countries, influencing ideologies and how Islam is understood and practiced. However, despite the rapid changes that are happening in Saudi Arabia now on women's rights, there doesn't seem to be any indication of that change influencing other Muslim majority countries that are already steeped in Islamism at the political, societal, and cultural levels. So they look at Saudi Arabia as an anomaly that is not to be emulated in that way. It is, as Leslie Ann had said, talked about earlier in terms of the shift of value systems. And for some of the Muslim majority countries, if not most of the Muslim majority countries, Islamism is going to be a challenge for us to dismantle. Turkey is a very interesting example because it is a model of, democracy. Because people have the right to vote, their governments and so on. However, we have seen how Islamism also comes into play in terms of how they have pushed forward very critical policies like family policies that are entrenched in the very conservative understanding or literal understanding of Islam. And I think this perhaps has actually more impact and influence on other countries who are practicing democracy at any level, because they see then that this is an opportunity for more Islamic or more strict Islamic laws to come into being. Conservative understanding of Islam through laws that is pushed through the parliamentary process and through the legislature. So perhaps, in the way that democracy itself is something for us to unpack in terms of how democracy is being practiced in our countries, and what are our spaces and our roles as women's rights activists to actually break through or push through the hegemony of conservative understanding of Islam. Because in a way, this framework we also already see happening in countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, and it's very, very critical that, more and more voices that are more moderate, because in a way, religion is something that's going to be really, really hard to get out of the public space, but that is also a demand that we can use. If you want if you want to rely on Islam as a source for public law and public policy, then everyone has a right to talk about it. And that means, not shutting out non-Muslim voices from the debate about what kinds of laws and practices that are actually being ingrained within the country.
Thank you very much, Rosanna. Now we move on to Anna, and we will have Maria doing some translation. So bear with us as we ask the questions and she answers. Anna Marcela, as a feminist academic, in your own words, what are we facing?
En tus propias palabras, ¿cuáles son los retos que estamos enfrentando?
Bueno, ante todo, primero agradecer todo este espacio tan importante en estos momentos, de estar creando lo que es esencial, las redes desde diferentes espacios que nos permitan enfrentar lo que estamos viviendo, ¿no? Lo que estamos viviendo como mundo
Voy a parar
en
aquí un momentito, disculpa, voy a traducir esta parte y la interpretación y todo. She says that the beginning is to really be grateful for this type of space, of creating networks of solidarity and networks that go deep the issues we want to discuss. That's the first thing, that is a way to face the current challenges. Sigue, disculpa.
Y agradecerte, María, por ese esfuerzo de hacer la traducción.
And take me through for this improvised translanguaging effort, but we're making it work. Gracias, Ana.
Yeah, I appreciate it. ¿A qué nos enfrentamos, no? Nos enfrentamos a un giro reaccionario global que que viene gestándose desde hace mucho, pero que lo podemos determinar a finales del siglo XX, que era muchísimo ya más claro hacia dónde caía, ¿no? Este giro reaccionario. Donde...
Voy a traducir esto primero. So we're facing a global shift that's very important. She calls it a global reactionary shift. I repeat that because it's important. A global reactionary shift that started at the end of the 20th century, that has been building up since the end of the 20th century.
Estamos frente al avance de un proyecto imperial, global, colonial, que articula, que pretende ser hegemónico, si es que no lo es ahora, que articula neoliberalismo, patriarcado, racismo, colonialidad, en todas sus expresiones y ramificaciones respecto a la violencia.
Voy a comenzar y violencia. So this is the advance of a imperial project that's also colonial and global, and that pretends to be uniform or hegemonic, neoliberal. It's also racist, it's patriarchal, it's colonial, and it's also reinforcing all forms of violence. So this is, again, pre-existing things.
Son extremas derechas, autoritarias, que buscan disciplinar cuerpos, subjetividades, que trata todo de encauzar hacia darle ese componente, ¿no? De dar un sentido común desde la desafección política que impera, donde la gente está enfadada con el sistema político, donde hay miedos porque nos han tratado de despojar de nuestras propias vidas, a quienes estamos en Europa también o en los nortes globales, nos damos cuenta cómo la precarización de la vida es cada vez peor, pero quienes también sabemos desde los sures globales cómo esto Europa lo está viviendo ahora, pero que para nosotras esto no es algo reciente, sino que es desde un recorrido histórico que nos ha golpeado en nuestros propios territorios desde hace muchísimo tiempo.
Voy a traducir esto. So, again, because this is all pre-existing, and again, it's coming from many global souths. It's really the rise of the extreme right, authoritarian, trying to discipline our bodies and our subjectivities. Also, people that are very frustrated and angry with the different political systems, people that are challenging and questioning the precarious value of life. And from the many global souths, this is really the intersection of a moment or what she calls like a journey, a historical journey that it's now merging or in a way clashing. Gracias, Ana.
Y ¿Y quiénes estamos en la diana de todo esto? ¿Quiénes estamos en el centro de estos discursos violentos, excluyentes, de estas políticas que son donde se menosprecia también la diversidad cultural? En la diana, en el centro de estos ataques, estamos las mujeres, sobre todo las más pobres, las más excluidas, estamos las personas migrantes, en el centro de este discurso, si lo podemos encontrar, está contra las personas migrantes, contra los cuerpos y las sexualidades disidentes, y generando también todo este control respecto a los cuerpos territorios. A estos cuerpos territorios me refiero también a todos estos sures globales, desde los pueblos indígenas, por ejemplo, latinoamericanos, que históricamente han estado fuera de los mismos estados, que no les ha llegado ni siquiera muchísima, lo que digo yo, la democracia insuficiente, ¿no? Que no los ha cobijado, pero que ahora es más. Son las personas indígenas con nuevas voces que nos han traído. Algo estamos hablando de colonial aquí, precisamente porque son esas voces que nos interpelan a construir un giro diferente, un sentido común diferente, pero que en este momento las están silenciando y las siguen violentando, como históricamente ha sido.
Ana, voy a traducir y un poquito breve para que no pierdas tiempo. Entonces, also in this dialogues or in this clash, women are at the center of the violence and the exclusionary fights. It's really any questioning of violence, of the lack of cultural value, of the lack of rights. Women are at the center. Our bodies are located at the center of this clash. And in particular, poor women are being excluded, migrant women are being excluded, any women from any sexualities or bodies that are not within the norm. And of course, in the global south, the narratives and experiences of indigenous women are very important because it brings together this clash and exclusion. And in particular, she says, it's important to see the way the global south has articulated or the way indigenous women have articulated their voices or organized themselves as a way to challenge what is happening in the global south in terms of challenging their bodies or their experience. Thank you, Ana. ¿Vas a decir algo más?
Sí, que en ese contexto, ¿no? Que es muy difícil de explicar porque, por un lado, tenemos las extremas derechas autoritarias, misóginas, violentas, de recortes de derechos, que la tenemos con Trump en los Estados Unidos, pero que también la tenemos, por ejemplo, en Centroamérica, con Bukele en El Salvador, con Rodrigo Chávez en Costa Rica, por citar ejemplos, ¿no? Que también lo tenemos en Europa, con Orbán, con Wilders, con Le Pen, con Meloni, en el caso del Estado español, claramente, con Ayuso en la Comunidad de Madrid, con Vox a nivel nacional y las políticas que están llevando a cabo Vox y PP, el Partido Popular, juntos, donde vemos que no es solamente un relato de las extremas derechas, sino que son como un árbol que tiene muchísimas ramas, pero donde está en el centro el ataque a los cuerpos disidentes, a las mujeres y sobre todo a las migraciones de los sures globales.
So she's saying at the end, in the complex context we're living, we're talking about extreme misogyny, a violent right wing, in governments like Trump, in Central America, like Bukele, like Rodrigo Chavez in Costa Rica. And in Europe, you also have this rise of the extreme right wing, which may be attacking women in a different way. And it's both at the local, at the national, and at the European level, at the regional level. And I think that the most important point is that the collision and this ideologies that exclude women may be very different. And she says it's like a tree with many branches, but at the core of it is this attack on women and on difference. And in particular, you know, the bodies and the experiences of migrant women and many other types of women. So that is really what's at stake.
Can we then move on to the next person? Thank you, Anna.
Yeah.
Leslie Ann, what would it take to flip the discourse by the US and its impact in Africa? Have we missed any major trends or issues?
Well, I think there are some trends rising, and certainly different formations, political formations, you know, would bring the current discourse into a different kind of view. And one of that is BRICS, you know, with Brazil, Russia, India, China, Africa. That formation has, to a large extent, it is a very worrying grouping for Trump in particular. He's mentioned that. He's mentioned, you know, how insecure he feels about that. And the reason for that is that other countries, like countries in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, I think 9 countries have also asked to join the BRICS formation. And I think there's a real concern about how these shifts will impact on the power that the colonial you know, project has had in Africa and other parts of the world. And I think there's a real concern that they have. And I think to some extent, I don't think it's to a great extent, because, you know, as Jockling has pointed out, everybody fears China. But what she's pointed out is that China doesn't have enough of a clout. But China has a clout in Africa. Every single African country that you go to, you'll see that China has invested in those countries in infrastructure development. I was in Ghana recently, and I was shocked by the number of factories that China is building. And of course, China brings in its own people, you know, to do the building and the development of those projects. Hospitals are being put up by China. So where in the past you'd have other European countries coming in and having these developments, that's being replaced by other powers now, like China. Russia's also there, India's there. You know, so they are all coming to contribute in some ways. Is that enough to shake the US? Maybe not, but it is making them feel very uncomfortable, and certainly that will, to a large extent, change the discourse. But in Africa, we are concerned about the development or the growth of was within our continent, because they also come flouting human rights, not being interested in the development, you know, of the communities and so forth. One of the big challenges we have is that in our industries, we do have natural resources that the world wants. Our gold, our diamonds, our platinum, our uranium, all these things that are now important for, you know, the development of, you know, the computers and cell phones and all these things. We have it on our continent, but it doesn't belong to us. The extractive industries are managed by the colonial powers. So the beneficiation of the raw materials takes place in other countries. That's why we remain poor and they get richer, because they are taking from us and continuing to build on this. If we are able to pull that back, if we are able to engage in beneficiation ourselves, then it will change, it'll flip the switch on that to a certain degree. But I think that maybe Jockling can give some more you know, insight into what could flip that switch. But from my perspective, that I think is some of the things that we should be concerned about. And of course, for South Africa, for instance, is pushing its human rights stand, and you know, it's saying this is our sovereignty is for us to determine. So as we gain back some of our resources and the power of that, then we will be able to. But we are still in a colonial we've been squeezed by colonial powers. I mean, I like the saying that says Africa is liberated, but its economies isn't. And that's the truth. Our economies are not, So that's something we have to look at. And our indebtedness, which Jocelyn can speak to very strongly, our indebtedness is a stranglehold on all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will move on to the second part. And I have questions at the end for people winding up, but I will move on to the second part, which is what are some of the analytical tools and frameworks that can improve our understanding? I will start with you, Jocelyn, and the question I have is, what are some tools and suggestions for understanding BRICS? Is it shifting geopolitics?
Thank you. I'm going to pick up from Leslie Ann's last comment, because I think that's really where we need to do our work. First, on the issue of debt. Some of the work that we have begun doing in Third World Network at looking and working with our partners at the country level, because every country's debt profile, history of how they accumulated that debt is very different. Who the creditors are very also different in its proportion. And I think we need to be able to make those analyses. And a lot of the data is publicly available. So, in some of our work with colleagues in the Pacific, and also looking at some of our own countries in the region, we find that if we understand better the debt history, who are the players, we can actually design our responses accordingly. So I would say debt is certainly an issue. I mean, right now, we think about how much indebted countries have already paid just to service. We're not even talking about paying back the capital, because the system is so deeply and structurally unjust that they keep pulling. We are net exporters of everything from physical, natural resources, especially Africa, to currency flows, right? Illicit flows, taxes that are not paid to our commodity extraction, and of course, the debt servicing. The debt service burden of most countries in the South exceeds its health budget, its education budget. So that is something structurally wrong. And so we need to really step up and really call for to renew the campaign for dealing with debt. On the extractives and the critical minerals, again, I think there are protests already across from Latin America to Asia and in Africa against extractivism, because it's the same old, from colonial days until now. It's just the same. It's just that they're extracting even more. And Europe, the contestation between, for Africa's resources, and now Greenland and even Ukraine and Gaza, underneath all these land are minerals. And that's the big fight. So I think we see protests at the community level, but we need to bring that analysis together. We need to link up on the protest level. Data centers, hyper data centers are consuming so much water and electricity and emitting for so-called the digital economy and TikTok and AI, things that we ourselves use in our lives as activists and consumers. There is such a high ecological and social cost, and people are protesting from Chile, and other Latin American countries all over to Asia. So I think we need to understand and that analysis of the whole supply chain and technology. The biggest companies now controlling us are the big tech companies. If you look at market capitalization, is Apple and Amazon and Nvidia, and so that whole concentration, and they are the ones ruling Washington now. Look at the inauguration, ceremony, right? We saw how they bought front seats. So and there are movements around global digital justice, people fighting on the ground, communities fighting for the land, and all that is still is just deeper layers. So I think that we are able to communicate more, and I see that happening. But we need to think about the kind of, and how to engage with our state. I know it's very difficult for some of us to engage with our own governments, but I think there may be a shift. There are opportunities in some countries, not so much in others. I think BRICS is going to be a real challenge. What South-South is, we really need to be part of the discussion, as civil society and as feminists, because that is going to be, again, a marginalized perspective. We need to be part of that. Now, BRICS is interesting because you got Russia in there, and now Russia is United States' new best friend. What is the role of Russia? We've been talking about China, but what about Russia? I think it's even harder to understand Russia. But we need to do that. We need to, and I don't think we should assume countries in BRICS or G20 from the South have kind of clear idea. I don't think they do. So I think there is an opportunity for us to engage where we can at the country level, and then we can link, because we've learned how to link with each other as civil society and academia. I think Anna's presence here really, and I think we should really move to that. I think there's so much happening across biodiversity, climate, agriculture, industrial policy. We are working more and more with academic research institutions so that their research and analysis can be much more related to the real world and what we need. And then we don't have to keep expanding because as civil society groups, we are doing a lot of research and analysis, but we need to actually have those partnerships with academia, North and South. And I think that's huge potential because we see that happening already in many places. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Yokeling. Rosanna, is it helpful to use the language of culture and rights or religious freedoms when it comes to the elimination of violence against women and girls in the Islamic nations in the global South?
Thank you very much for that really tough question, I think, because I do think it is also contextual. Because when it comes to language, experience taught me that we have to meet the people where they're at. While, when it comes to law and policy, it's very clear, the language of rights, language of fundamental liberties is key, but we may have to unpack those terminologies in the understanding of how some violations are perpetuated in the name of culture and religion. So the challenge is how language on all of these have also been co-opted by the right wing, because they speak about there is no such thing as universal human rights, but that human rights must fit into a cultural mold of the majority, for example. So this is where I think, especially with the new generation, with the language that's also used on social media, that's used with the young people, there needs to be a little bit more cross-cultural, cross-movement, intergenerational discussion and conversation amongst each other in terms of how then do we meet the people where they're at, and in terms of the mediums that we're going to use to be able to reach them. There is also a lot of opportunity for us to use social media to unpack all of these concepts and different understandings of elimination of violence, what that looks like. And we also need to remember that, actually 70% of language is also not in what we say, but also in how we do and portray and act. And I think, incorporating the work or working with artists, working with creative people is very, very key in terms of unpacking and meeting these concepts with the people, because it's certainly, what I feel that, is a challenge for me as an activist in Malaysia is how even trying to use the word gender equality in our local language is a challenge, and what that means and how that looks like for the mainstream public. So this is where we need to figure out also the tactics of the right wing and conservative, because they have a way of putting out communications and language, and at the same time, we don't want to also be too reductive in what we're trying to say, because what we say has gravity, has importance, and in the way, we are able to shape and change mindsets when it comes to upholding women's rights and how that looks like within the framework of democracy and human rights principles.
Thank you, Rosanna. Let's move on to Anna Marcela. How can we move forward? And what are other thought tools we can consider?
Sorry, we're mute. Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
How can we move forward? And what other thought tools we can consider?
¿Cómo podemos avanzar lo máximo posible y qué tipo de herramientas de pensamiento podemos utilizar o cosas nuevas?
Bueno, desde mi perspectiva, considero que es importante hacer esa relación necesaria y urgente entre el activismo y y la academia. No tenemos que jugar en ese plano, llegar a puntos de encuentro y de crítica que puede ser incluso mutua. Eso es uno de los puntos que creo que es importante.
I think the first point is that I think it's really important to really reevaluate the relationship and synergies between bridging academia and activism. First, to create more opportunities for meeting points, but also to be open to more critiques where we mutually critique each other in a way that creates growth.
Además, considero que es importante entendernos como no solo un movimiento feminista, no hay un movimiento feminista, sino feminismos en movimiento, en plural. Muchas expresiones feministas que están situadas en diferentes partes del mundo, en diferentes territorios, con diferentes recorridos y experiencias históricas que debemos poner en valor. No hay un solo feminismo, sino feminismos en movimiento. Y ese movimiento, entender a los feminismos en movimiento, es entendernos en nuestra propia diversidad, en nuestras propias historias.
Okay. Sorry, I'm writing this down because it's very important. So besides understanding that we're not one movement, we're feminisms in movement. We're many expressions of feminisms, and we're many expressions of feminism that must be valued and understood in our own diversity, understanding the contextual analysis of where we come from, and also the value of our own stories.
Es además dar un valor especial en este mismo contexto, ¿no? En esta misma proyección que trato de hacer, de los feminismos autónomos, situados, contextualizados a cada realidad, antirracistas, anticapitalistas, con una vocación profunda anticolonialista, y crear espacios de diálogo escucha, ese diálogo escucha que nos permita encontrarnos no como identidades esencialistas, sino como experiencias diversas que deben poner en común para hacer frente a lo que tenemos, para hacer frente a estos monstruos a los que estamos tratando desde diferentes trincheras de pararle los pies.
Also give value to autonomous feminisms that are better contextualized and located and situated in anti-racism anti-colonialism, listening dialogues are probably better to understand the diverse experiences that bring us together and that give us strength to face, as she calls it, the common monsters of what we've been talking about, the common leadership in the wing.
Los diálogos de escucha que implican crear espacios horizontales, abiertos, plurales, donde el intercambio de saberes y experiencias no busque homogenizarnos ni silenciarnos, sino potenciar las diferentes voces. Y una cosa muy importante es darle valor al conflicto, porque dentro de nosotras mismas, como esos feminismos en movimiento, tenemos diferentes posiciones. Hay que darle un valor al conflicto para que nos permita la creatividad suficiente, que nos permita construir alianzas desde el reconocimiento mutuo, valorando nuestras propias contradicciones en la heterogeneidad necesaria como una fuente de riqueza política y de conocimientos y de experiencias políticas en esa diversidad, más que el enfrentamiento de las dicotomías que a veces nos ponen también a pensar, que es la dicotomía blanco y negro, es vernos en un recorrido que tendrá sus diferencias, pero que también tiene sus coincidencias. Y desde ahí encontrar los mínimos éticos para seguir construyendo, para seguir dialogando y tomando una posición de lucha en esas genealogías mestizas, diversas, mestizas como lo hablaba Gloria Saldúa, ¿no? Creativas, desde una lógica anticolonial, anti-extractivista, y donde se ponga en este valor estas alianzas feministas en defensa de nuestras propias memorias como mujeres en diferentes territorios y experiencias vitales.
So these listening dialogues are a way to understand, it's this idea that we talk and listen to each other without silencing in a horizontal, open, plural way to exchange without erasing the experience of women of the South. The value of difference also requires the feminist movements of the feminist in movement to understand that there's great value in conflict, and creative alliance building isn't reaching because we need to understand their own contradictions, and that the binaries and dichotomies and the ways to simplify our experiences are not working, are limiting our journeys and stories. So ethical minimums require building this mixed and blended stories of our movements that are anti-colonial, anti-extractive, alliance building, that is really about the rememory of and the memories of women all over the global South.
Y creo que también hay que hacer críticas respecto a ciertos feminismos que han potenciado o que han abierto también puertas para, y sobre todo en los sures globales, que nos hablan de ese énfasis en un empoderamiento individual, no colectivo, sino individual, que nos hablan de derechos humanos desde las institucionalidades, pero que mientras hablan de derechos humanos y feminismo, por ejemplo, impulsan políticas que han excluido a las mujeres más empobrecidas, a las mujeres que han soportado históricamente el sistema patriarcal, capitalista y absolutamente racista en el que nos desenvolvemos, y que han llevado también a una despolitización de luchas feministas, y incluso a una banalización de temas como es el extractivismo, como es la defensa de la madre tierra, de la Pachamama, como dicen los pueblos de Villa Yala, en América Latina, Villa Yala, y que son de alguna vez complicidad con la lógica neoliberal, pero que también los tenemos aquí en Europa y que es un trabajo que ha hecho Sarah Farris en un libro que se llama En nombre de los derechos de las mujeres, en esa lógica donde se crean desde ciertos discursos feministas, se crea un espacio racista para seguir atacando desde las derechas a las personas migrantes y a las mujeres racializadas en Europa, que son temas que creo que quedan abiertos para seguir construyendo ese horizonte de feminismos contextualizados.
Anna, I think we're out of time, so I'm going to summarize the interpretation. Yeah. So what she says is that the criticism of feminisms, it's really important not to be too individualistic, because the critique of the feminists we don't align with is that it's not looking at the collectivities, it's excluding the experiences of poor women and women that have survived systems that are very discriminatory. And if we don't take those views into account, we're limiting the defense of women's rights. So to really value that defense of nature, of Pachamama, of those innate rights that come from women of the South, it's really important to ensure that our feminisms are critical of feminisms that are racist and that really perpetuate the agendas of what it is we're trying to oppose. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Maria. It's okay.
Toko, you're on mute.
Yeah.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Anna. Moving on to a last question, I'm asking all the panelists, please just 1 minute, because we need to go to the questions and other people coming in. The question is, what is the one critical question that anyone trying to make sense of the global events should ask when reading the news? What is the one critical question anyone trying to make sense of global events ask when reading the news? Yokling?
These days, I will say the first question I will ask, is this information verified and correct? And how do I get together with my fellow activists and feminists so that we can collectively analyze and think about how we're going to act?
Leslie Ann?
I think, Jocelyn is absolutely spot on, because so much information coming through is fake information. My question would be, how does this impact on women and women's rights? I think that's a critical question. And will it contribute to increased levels of violence against women and girls? Because then my response has to be tailored to address that particular issue. For me, that would be a critical question. Thank you.
Rosano?
I'm just taking this one step further in terms of what Leslie Ann had already said. And that's, we should always ask, where are the women in all of this when all of this is happening? To what extent their voices are being heard or otherwise? And who are the women who are speaking up for women's positions and women's rights? So those would be my questions.
Thank you. Ana?
Gracias. Considero que es nada más en la misma línea de las demás compañeras y señalar que además nos debemos preguntar a quién beneficia esa narrativa, a quién está silenciando y qué estructuras de poder reproduce o está encubriendo. Para mí es todo lo que habéis dicho, más esta parte, a quién está silenciando, qué está reproduciendo y estas narrativas qué violencias están potenciando.
So we must, in line with what everybody's saying, we must also ask ourselves, over and above what you all said, who benefits from this narrative? Who is being silenced by this narrative? And what is the type of violence that's being perpetrated, or what system through this narrative?
Thank you. Leslie Ann, a last question before we move on. What does the practice of repoliticizing violence against women bring attention to?
I think the one thing that we must admit is that there is a very concerted, serious attack on women's rights and the dilution of all of the gains that we've made over the last few decades. The proclamation that women's rights are human rights, the fact that violence against women is a human rights issue, all of these gains that we have made as feminists across the world, that comes under attack now. And Trump has made that a very clear issue in his presidency, is that it comes from a very conservative Christian perspective on what a woman is and what her role and her job is. And he's using, they've co-opted our language and talking about, but we're protecting women, we're protecting women's rights and so forth. But it is a very conservative, very retrogressive stance, and it completely annihilates the gains that we have made. And other countries are jumping onto that bandwagon to do that as well. So I think that we have a very serious attack on women, on women's rights, and this is what we have to, and that's across all spheres of society, on all spheres of government. So we have to position ourselves to address that, and to hold on tightly onto the few advantages that we still have, but to fight constantly to keep the gains that we've made over years. The fact that Russia completely did away with its domestic violence law, the fact that Turkey has withdrawn from the European Convention, the Istanbul Convention, developed in their own country, that's telling us that there's a trend, that is growing across Europe, and it'll grow on our own continents in the South as well, especially where we have strong, retrogressive, conservative, religious movements. I'll call them movements, and it's across all religions. It's not just one religion. So those are the really tough things that I think we are facing at the moment, and we need to have a response for that. And one of the things the International Network on Violence Against Women is going to do is have a meeting now to discuss what are those issues and how do we move ourselves. Now do we, and you know what I want to say, we have been in this position before as women's rights activists. Over many decades, we found ourselves, with our backs against the wall, and we have prevailed. So what we've got to take with us into this new battle, this new fight, is that we will prevail. We just have to find those new mechanisms, those new, you asked about mechanisms just now, those new ways of working. How do we use AI in our own struggles, equality, and the recognition of women's human rights? Thank you, Togo.
Thank you. Maria, do we have any questions? If not, I can
there is
another question for the panelists.
I will read one I see.
Okay.
How does the global resistance to feminism affect efforts to achieve gender equality, especially in conservative and patriarchal societies? Recently in Nigeria, a female senator was suspended for speaking up against sexual harassment by the Senate government, which led to Senate President maligning her. It looks like gender equality, especially in government offices in Nigeria, just took a U-turn.
Yeah.
Anyone wants to talk to that?
I just think that that's a demonstration of what we've just said. that gender equality is going to take a thrashing, in across our continents with conservative governments, and Nigeria has got a conservative government, in place. So we're going to see more of that happening, and we have to be vigilant about this and ready to take it on. And I think the women's movement in Nigeria, which is has a history of great activism, should be taking this up, as a critical concern for them.
If I can just maybe quickly add, I think the assault and in every sense of the word, I think also needs, and this is what we have built up a bit more over the years, is solidarity at the regional and global level, so that the women in Nigeria, any one country, they are not alone. And I think communications allow us to amplify, to spread, to shine light on the abuse, and it's very important to do that.
Thank you.
Coco, can I make a small point, Justice Maria?
Yeah.
I also wanted to say that in the last 30 years, intersectionality and all the categories of that amazing way of analyzing intersection and intersecting forms of discrimination against women, the categories have grown. And I think part of holding ourselves to account is to hold ourselves to account, like disabilities. We always talk, for example, women with, there's so many types of disabilities, visible and invisible, and the understanding has grown. With racism and ethnicity, the same thing. We now have a bigger understanding of what it is, right? And how many identities are within every identity we dissect. So I think holding ourselves, on that practice of intersectionality is just as important in our decolonial struggle. So I just wanted to mention that. I mean, it's been mentioned, but not explicitly. Thank you.
Okay. For the panelists, I have one last question for you.
Oh.
As women's rights activists working towards the elimination of inequality and violence against women and girls in the global South, what are the main forces we are facing right now? What are the main forces we are facing right now?
I'll go first. I think one of the main forces, of course, is the rise of the right-wing governments across, not just Europe, but also in Asia, in Africa. The right-wing governments are coming to the fore. So that's one of the forces that we are facing. And then the depoliticizing of women's rights issues, of violence against women in particular. That's why Inevawg has a central to its existence is how do we repoliticize violence against women? I think that's critical. So and then the racism and xenophobia, I mean, all of those major challenges are what we are facing now, and the religious conservatism. I think it's quite frightening what's happening. And it's amazing. I was speaking to somebody in Germany yesterday, and they were saying that all of a sudden Nazi groups have visibility and credibility in Germany. Well, I suppose not all of a sudden they've been there, but now they are emboldened to take to public spaces and to be, vocal about the expressions, of racism and so forth. And that's quite shocking. And when I found somebody in Sweden, they said, well, we've got a Nazi government, that's it. And all of that has meant that the shift in the value system of the world is what we are facing now. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll jump in at this point too. I think that the manifestation of what Leslie Ann just described for the work that I do with, in the area of economics justice, is that it manifests itself in really continuing to deepen and lock in more the structural injustices across economics. So we're talking about finance, trade, investment, how that framing of relationship in the economic sphere, which is really about livelihood and how we deal with resources we extract from the planet. And women have been subject to major violence in that production development model, and it's getting worse. And I think we've discussed this before, that the superficial notion of empowerment of women as being more inclusivity in finance, bringing women into the global supply chain, is actually perpetuating the violence and even deepening the violence. And I think that's the kind of pushback that Inevawg and many feminist groups have actually brought up in the last 10 years. The other thing that is actually very worrisome is the rejection of good science that we see in the Trumpian administration. And it will also, like conservatism and patriarchy, is latent in many of our societies, this rejection of science. Science has its problems. It needs to be accountable. But to reject that and to say if you die of tuberculosis and get sick is because you're poor, your diet is not good enough or whatever. I think that's very scary, because we have just come out of a pandemic. And that skepticism, I think, shakes us very massively. And just for information, yesterday or a few hours ago, the state's treasury, the Minister of Finance, I suppose, as we will all call them, of the US, came out to say that on the 2nd of April, they're going to announce 15 countries whom they have called the Dirty 15. And these are countries that, in the assessment of the Trump administration, have either high tariffs on our goods coming into our country, or non-tariff barriers. So if we have national policies that are good for our national development, when we want to have regulations that will make foreign investors do things that will benefit our country and our people, all these non-tariff barriers that make business and profit making more expensive for the United States are all going to be calculated, and those countries will get reciprocal tariffs slapped on them. And then they say there'll be no waivers. These countries are all going to be punished. And you can come to us, and then we can negotiate a deal. And this is the pattern of that I think worries many of us. And what will the deals be? It will be about more extraction of minerals from your country, or whatever, or back off on supporting the Gaza and the people of Palestine. It opens the door, and that's a kind of transactional approach that is actually very, very worrisome for the next few years.
Thank you, Yokelin. Rosanna?
I just want to add in terms of the way right-wing forces, both state and non-state actors, have been attacking the arts, cultural, and literature spaces. And it has really affected the way then how some of the artists on the ground have had to actually repackage themselves to fit in with the acceptance of the right-wing definition of the right culture, the right kind of arts that can be displayed, the right kind of literature and books that can be read, which really hampers then, our whole identity in a way, the richness of our own cultural heritage. And it's completely going to affect the way then how we actually are comfortable with the fact that we've actually lived in a diverse community, but then now we've become more polarized than ever because of these narrowing of understanding of our own cultural and arts heritage. Thank you.
Thank you. Anna?
Yeah, thank you. Nos enfrentamos al avance de las extremas derechas, a una criminalización absoluta de quienes defienden también su derecho a existir, de su derecho a tener su cuerpo territorio, y siguen resistiendo a la cooptación de las agendas feministas, a una fragmentación de luchas, a ese despojo extractivista que lo vemos, que lo sentimos, a una violencia digital, a una violencia mediática, al mundo dividido en dos o en tres. Y recordar siempre que en los nortes hay sures que no es solamente una cuestión de un mundo norte y sur global, sino que también dentro de los nortes hay sures y dentro de los sures también tenemos nortes. Nos surge poner en valor las militancias, el trabajo cercano con las mujeres que han estado más excluidas de todo el relato y feminista también. No podemos seguir de seguir pensando en una cooperación internacional salvacionista, sino reimaginar las relaciones norte y sur hacia construir una justicia que sea distributiva, que ponga en valor la distribución y no olvidar como feministas nunca ni el racismo, pero jamás tampoco la clase social que nos sigue atravesando a todas las personas y que las luchas tienen que ir creciendo en ese sentido, porque lo que nos estamos enfrentando es a un proyecto imperial, a un proyecto hegemónico que nos está violentando.
Thank you.
So we're facing the advance of the right, extreme right, and also the criminalization of women human rights defenders that are facing violence of many types and in many spheres, whether it's in the media or through the criminal systems. But we must remember that there are norths in the south and souths in the north, and that we can't be looking at international cooperation as a way to perpetuate the savior complex, and that part of the struggles must always take into account racism and classism. We can't achieve feminist equality and women's human rights ignoring classism and racism, because it creates a hegemonic or forced dialogue or discourse. Thank you.
To the panelists, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your understanding with all of us. We really do appreciate you. We appreciate your time, and we hope we will continue to have these dialogues, these conversations together to strengthen ourselves and to pick up different tools that we can use in each of our struggle. You are very much appreciated, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody that's participated.
Thank you,
And
Toko.
we'll have
Thank you,
another of these
Maria.
dialogues
Yeah.
next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you all. Yeah.
See you soon, Rosanna, in person at home in
Yes.
KL.
See you.
Yeah.
All right,
See
thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Leslie. And
Bye.
thank you. It was an
Bye.
amazing discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank
Yeah.
You did.
Yes. Thank you.